Pick any wife. The judge laughed, but the whole courtroom froze when the giant cowboy pointed to the black obese woman in chains. The crowd jeered, the gavel slammed, and the dust of the frontier seemed to stop in the air. A man who had lived alone in the mountains just claimed the most mocked woman in town, not out of cruelty, but out of something no one expected: respect. But what began as a shocking choice hides a deeper danger, because this woman carries a secret, a ledger of corruption that powerful men would kill to bury. The railroad wants her silenced. The sheriff will drag her back in irons. And the judge's laughter might just mask a deadly scheme. As thunder rolls over the peaks and lamplight flickers in the cabin, did this cowboy just choose a wife? Or declare war against the most dangerous men in the West? Every story I share leads with love for people, for healing, for the things we sometimes forget to say out loud. The wooden floorboards creaked under the weight of restless boots as men packed the makeshift courtroom. Tobacco smoke hung thick in the air, mingling with the sharp scent of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies. Judge Horace Kettle's gavel crashed down, sending echoes through the converted saloon that now served as the county courthouse. Order. Order. In this court? The judge's voice boomed across the room, though his eyes sparkled with cruel amusement. His jowls quivered as he surveyed the jeering crowd. Now, gentlemen, we've saved the best entertainment for last. At the back of the room, Luke Brannon's tall frame filled the doorway. His weathered face remained still as stone as he observed the scene, one shoulder propped against the doorframe. The worn leather of his gun belt creaked softly as he shifted. His weight. Two deputies dragged forward a woman in chains. Clarissa Carter stood straight despite her bonds, her eyes fixed ahead, refusing to meet the mocking stares of the crowd. Her plain dress was dusty but clean, her graying hair neat beneath a simple cloth. Well, well. Judge Kettle's voice dripped with false joviality. What do we have here? The railroad's lost property? Laughter rippled through the crowd. A cook, who couldn't keep her mouth shut about company business. But perhaps one of you fine gentlemen might find some use for her? Clarissa's jaw tightened, but she kept her dignity. The chains rattled softly as she clasped her hands together. Look at the size of her, someone called out. She'd eat a man? Out of house and home. Might make a good plow horse, though. Another voice added, bringing fresh waves of laughter. The judge leaned forward, his smile widening. Come now, surely someone wants a ready-made cook? Though I warn you, she's got a sharp tongue to match her appetite. He paused for effect. Shall we start the bidding at 50 cents? More jeers and crude jokes filled the air. Clarissa stood, unmoved, but her eyes held a deep pain beneath their strength. 25 cents? The judge called out. Why, that's barely the price of a good meal, and she clearly knows about those. His face reddened with delight at his own wit. The floorboards groaned as Luke pushed away from the doorframe. His spurs jingled softly as he made his way forward, parting the crowd like Moses at the Red Sea. At 6 feet 4 inches, he towered over most men present, and there was something in his quiet presence that commanded attention. 5 cents. The judge was saying, surely she's worth. He broke off as Luke reached the front, looking up at the giant cowboy with surprise. Well, if it isn't Luke Brannon. The judge recovered quickly, spreading his arms wide. Come to join our little auction. Take your pick of any wife here, though I'm afraid the prettier ones are already spoke for. He winked at the crowd. Luke's voice was soft, but carried clearly through the suddenly quiet room. I'll take her. He pointed directly at Clarissa. For a moment, nobody moved. Then laughter erupted, louder than before. The judge wiped tears from his eyes. Good joke, Brannon. Now, which one did you really want? No joke. Luke reached into his vest and pulled out a handful of coins. They clattered on the judge's bench, the sound cutting through the laughter. I reckon that's enough to cover any fine she might owe. The judge's smile faltered. Now see here, Brannon. She deserves dignity, Luke continued, his quiet voice somehow filling the room. Not mockery. Not chains. His eyes met Clarissa's for the first time, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of shared pain and quiet strength. Clarissa's expression didn't change, but her shoulders straightened ever so slightly. She studied Luke's face, searching for any sign of mockery or ulterior motive, but found only sincere determination in his steady gaze. The room had gone deadly quiet. Judge Kettle's face worked through several expressions: amusement, confusion, anger, before settling into a calculating smile. Well, he said slowly. If Mr. Brannan wants to saddle himself with such a unique bride, who are we to stand in his way? He picked up the coins, counting them with exaggerated care. Though I must warn you, she's been charged with interfering in railroad business. Serious matter, that. The money's there, Luke said simply. More than fair price for false charges. The judge's eyes narrowed, but the coins disappeared into his pocket. Very well. He banged his gavel. Sold to the man with unusual taste. He smirked at the crowd, trying to recover his earlier jovial tone. Though I reckon he'll regret. This purchase come supper time. A few nervous laughs followed, but most men stood silent, uncertain how to react to this unexpected turn of events. Luke stepped forward, pulling a key from his pocket. He'd clearly come prepared. Without ceremony, he unlocked Clarissa's chains, himself letting them fall to the floor with a heavy clank. Clarissa rubbed her wrists where the iron had chafed them. She looked up at Luke, her expression guarded but dignified. Much obliged, she said softly, her voice carrying the musical lilt of the South. Luke nodded once, then turned to face the judge. We'll be going now. It wasn't a question. Judge Kettle waved his hand dismissively, but his eyes were cold. Take your prize and go. May you both find what you deserve. Luke offered his arm to Clarissa, treating her with the courtesy he'd show any lady. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand lightly on his forearm. Together they walked toward the door, the crowd parting before them in stunned silence. Just before they reached the exit, a drunk cowboy found his voice. Hey, Brannan. Want to sell her once you've had your fun? I might have used for a cook myself. Luke stopped, turned. His voice was still quiet, but it carried an edge of steel that made the heckler step back. The lady is not for sale. Not now. Not ever. With that, he escorted Clarissa out into the bright Colorado sunshine, leaving behind a courthouse full of men who had just witnessed something they never expected to see, and a judge whose smile had turned to a scowl of frustrated calculation. The heavy iron shackles clattered to the wooden floor, their harsh sound echoing through the now hushed courthouse. Clarissa Carter swayed slightly, her legs unsteady after hours of standing in chains. Her hands trembled as she rubbed her chafed wrists, dark bruises already forming beneath her skin. Look at that. The giant's done lost his mind. Someone shouted from the back of the room. The spell of silence broke, and the courthouse erupted in a cacophony of jeers and laughter. I want my money back, Judge. A red-faced man in the front row demanded, standing up and shaking his fist. Paid good coin to see justice served, not this fool's circus. Luke Brannan's steady hand found Clarissa's elbow, supporting her with gentle strength. His touch was light but sure, like a man used to handling spooked horses. Clarissa flinched at first, then forced herself to accept the help, her legs still wobbling beneath her. Easy now, Luke murmured, his voice barely audible above the crowd's growing discontent. His massive frame shielded her from the worst of the hostile stares. Judge Kettle's face had turned an ugly shade of purple, but he made a show of shuffling through his papers. With exaggerated reluctance, he pulled out an official release document. Well, Mr. Brannan, since you're so determined to make this unusual purchase. His pen scratched across the paper, each stroke deliberate and slow. Sheriff Harlan Dodd stepped forward, his badge catching the light as he leaned in close to Luke. His voice was low and oily, meant for Luke's ears alone. You might want to reconsider, Brannan. That woman ain't just some vagrant. She's listed as property of the railroad's debtor trust. His hand rested meaningfully on his gun belt. Powerful men have interests in this matter. Men who don't take kindly to interference. Luke's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly. He kept his eyes forward, focused on the judge's desk, as if the sheriff hadn't spoken all. Last chance, Dodd hissed. Walk away now, no hard feelings, or make enemies you can't afford? Luke's only response was to adjust his grip on Clarissa's elbow, steadying her as she swayed again. The judge thrust the signed paper toward Luke with obvious distaste. There's your precious document. Now get out of my courthouse before sense returns to that addled brain of yours. Luke tucked the paper into his vest with his free hand, then guided Clarissa toward the door. The crowd's mood had turned ugly, and men pressed in from all sides, their faces twisted with mockery and disgust. Hey, big man! How much for an hour with your new wife? Reckon she'll break your bed first night. Better reinforce that floor, Brannon. Luke's broad shoulders carved a path through the press of bodies, his presence alone enough to make most men step back. Clarissa kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her chin high despite the cruel words flying around her. Her fingers dug into Luke's arm, betraying her tension, but she matched his steady pace. The bright Colorado sun hit them like a physical force as they emerged from the courthouse. Clarissa squinted, raising one hand to shield her eyes. After the dim interior, the world seemed harsh and overbright, the dusty street stretching out before them like an endless desert. Luke's horse stood waiting, a sturdy bay gelding with patient eyes. Luke led Clarissa to its side, then turned to face her. May I? He asked quietly, his hands hovering near her waist. Waiting for permission, Clarissa nodded stiffly, and Luke lifted her onto the horse with surprising gentleness for such a big man. She settled herself sideways on the saddle, arranging her skirts with dignity, despite the continued jeers from the courthouse steps. Luke took the reins and led the horse forward at a walk. He could have mounted up behind her, could have spurred the horse to a gallop to escape the hostile stares, and shouted insults more quickly. Instead, he chose to walk beside her, setting a deliberate pace that spoke of calm purpose rather than flight. The horse's hooves struck up little puffs of dust with each step. They passed the general store, the saloon, the blacksmith shop. Faces appeared in windows, conversations stopped mid-sentence as the strange pair made their way down the main street. You bought nothing but trouble. Clarissa's voice was barely above a whisper, bitter as medicine. Nothing but trouble and grief, mister. Luke glanced up at her, his eyes clear and steady. Then it's my trouble now. Clarissa looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. No more words passed between them as they made their way out of town. But the rhythm of the horse's hooves spoke volumes, steady, unhurried, marking each step away from bondage and toward an uncertain future. The courthouse crowd's shouts faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of wind through prairie grass and the creak of saddle leather. The sun beat down from a vast blue sky, and dust rose in their wake, marking their passage across the Colorado plain. Behind them, Sheriff Dodd watched from the courthouse steps, his face dark with calculation as he pulled out a telegram form, and began to write. The afternoon sun hung low in the western sky, painting the Colorado foothills in shades of amber and gold. Luke's bay gelding plodded steadily upward along a winding trail, its hooves finding sure footing among the scattered rocks. Clarissa sat stiffly in the saddle, her back rigid despite hours of riding. Every few minutes she shifted uncomfortably. Unused to such long hours on horseback, Luke walked beside them, his long stride matching the horse's pace. The silence between them stretched like a drawn bowstring, taut with unspoken questions. Finally, Clarissa could bear it no longer. Why? The word burst from her like a startled bird. Why would you do such a foolish thing, buying a stranger's freedom, and a colored woman at that? Luke kept his eyes on the trailhead, considering his words carefully. Saw too much cruelty in that courthouse. His voice was low and gravelly, as if unused to much talking. Couldn't stand by and watch anymore, that's all. Clarissa's tone held disbelief. Just couldn't stand by? Sometimes that's reason enough. The horse's bridle jingled softly as they wound their way higher into the foothills. The late summer heat pressed down on them, and dust coated their clothes. Ahead, the sound of running water drew their attention. Creek's just yonder, Luke said, gesturing to a stand of cottonwoods. Horse needs water. Reckon we could use some too. He led them off the main trail toward the trees. The creek burbled over smooth stones, clear and cool from the mountain snowmelt. Luke helped Clarissa down from the saddle, his hands respectfully steady at her waist. She stumbled slightly as her feet touched ground, her legs trembling from the long ride. While Luke tended to the horse, Clarissa made her way to the creek's edge. She knelt awkwardly, her joints protesting after hours of riding. Cupping her hands, she drank deeply of the sweet water, letting it wash away the dust of the courthouse and the bitter taste of humiliation. Used to cook for the railroad crews, she said suddenly, still staring at the flowing water. Good honest work, keeping accounts of supplies, feeding hungry men. Her voice hardened, till they accused me of stealing from the commissary. Wouldn't listen to reason, wouldn't check. The book's proper, just threw me in chains. Luke stood quietly by the horse, giving her words the weight of respect. Railroad men can be hard masters. Hard ain't the word for it. Clarissa's fingers traced patterns in the water. Cruel is more like it, and proud. Don't take kindly to being proved wrong, especially by the likes of me. The sun slipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. Luke led the horse away from the creek and began gathering dry wood for a fire. His movements were efficient, a man used to making camp alone. Best settle here for the night, he said, arranging stones in a circle. Cabin still, half a day's ride, and these trails ain't safe in the dark. Clarissa watched him work, noting how he kept a respectful distance. Still, she wrapped her arms around herself, uncomfortable with this strange man and the wild night closing in around them. Luke noticed her discomfort and pulled a heavy wool blanket from his saddlebags. Here, he said, holding it out to her. Night gets cold up here. She took the blanket cautiously, wrapping it around her shoulders. It smelled of horse and leather, but it was clean and warm. Luke got the fire started, the flames casting dancing shadows on the creek bank. He settled on the opposite side, giving her plenty of space. The prairie wind began to rise, howling through the cottonwoods like a mournful song. Clarissa pulled the blanket tighter, watching Luke across the flames. His massive frame was still. His eyes focused on the fire as if seeing something far beyond the dancing light. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, his lips began to move. Lord, watch over us this night, he whispered. Keep us safe from harm and guide us toward morning's light. Amen. Clarissa's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected prayers from this giant of a man. The simple faith in his words touched something deep inside her, something she thought long buried under years of bitterness and pain. She found herself studying his face in the firelight, seeing past the intimidating size to something gentler in his weathered features. The wind continued its lonely song across the prairie, and the fire crackled between them. Neither spoke again, but the silence had changed. It was still uneasy, still full of questions and doubts, but somewhere in its depths, a tiny seed of trust had taken root. Clarissa settled back against a fallen log, the blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. Luke remained on his side of the fire, his quiet presence both unsettling and oddly reassuring. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold in the vast Colorado sky. As they settled into their first night, a fragile peace dot gone painted the eastern sky in soft bands of pink and gold. Luke and Clarissa broke camp quietly, the morning chill making their breath visible in small clouds. Luke helped her mount the horse with the same gentle respect he'd shown the night before, then gathered the reins to lead them onward. The trail wound through patches of sagebrush, their silvery green leaves catching the early light. Rocky slope rose around them, dotted with scraggly pines that clung stubbornly to the thin soil. Luke kept a steady pace, mindful of Clarissa's obvious discomfort in the saddle. Line shack up ahead, Luke said, pointing to a weathered structure nestled against a rocky outcrop. Used to be a way station for cowboys moving herds through, empty now. Clarissa studied the abandoned building, its windows dark and shutters hanging loose. Seems mighty lonely out here. Can be Luke admitted. "But the land speaks if you learn to listen." They crossed a dried stream, its rocky bottom telling tales of spring floods long past. Luke explained how the seasonal waters carved paths through the valley, bringing life to the high desert when the snow melted. His voice carried a quiet reverence when he spoke of the land. "Blue mountains yonder," he gestured toward distant peaks, that seemed to float like islands in the morning haze. "That's where the snow stays longest. Feeds the creeks clear through summer." Clarissa found herself leaning forward slightly, absorbing his words despite the ache in her muscles. There was something soothing in his careful descriptions, as if he were sharing secrets with a trusted friend rather than instructing a stranger. The sun climbed higher, warming the cool morning air. Clarissa shifted uncomfortably, trying to ease the soreness from hours in the saddle. Luke noticed her discomfort, but said nothing, simply slowing their pace a bit more. Near midday, the trail dipped into a protected valley. Green pastures spread out before them, dotted with grazing cattle. And there, tucked against a gentle slope, stood Luke's cabin. The sturdy log structure seemed to grow naturally from the landscape, its weathered walls and cedar shake roof blending with the surrounding pines. Clarissa drew in a sharp breath at the profound solitude of the place. No other buildings broke the horizon. No smoke rose from distant chimneys. The only sounds were the wind in the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Luke led them to the cabin's front door, helping Clarissa down from the horse. Her legs trembled as they touched ground, and she had to steady herself against the saddle for a moment. Luke pretended not to notice, giving her time to recover her dignity. The cabin door creaked open, releasing the smell of pine logs and old leather. Dust motes danced in the sunlight that streamed through two small windows. A pot-bellied stove sat cold in one corner, while rough-hewn shelves lined the walls. Everything was neat but covered in a fine layer of dust. "It ain't much," Luke said, quietly setting her small bundle on a table made from split logs. "And it needs a woman's touch, I reckon. Sorry for its rough state." Clarissa looked around the single room, taking in the simple furnishings. A narrow bed with a wool blanket, a wooden chair with a worn cushion, shelves holding tin plates and cups, dried beans and cornmeal in glass jars. Everything spoke of solitude, of a life stripped down to essentials. Almost without thinking, she moved toward the shelves. Her fingers itched to bring order to the space, to clear away the dust and neglect. It was an old instinct, born of years managing railroad kitchens and commissaries. "I'll tend to the horse," Luke said, reading something in her expression. "Take your time getting settled." He ducked through the door. Leaving her alone in the cabin, Clarissa found a rag in a drawer and began wiping down the shelves. The simple task centered her, gave her something solid to focus on besides the strangeness of her situation. She worked steadily through the afternoon, organizing supplies and sweeping away cobwebs. As dusk approached, she located an iron skillet and some basic provisions. The familiar routine of cooking calmed her further. She mixed cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt, forming the dough with practiced hands. Beans simmered in a pot on the stove, filling the cabin with their homey aroma. Luke returned as the sun was setting, bringing with him the smell of horses and hay. He paused in the doorway, taking in the transformed space. The shelves gleamed. The floor was swept, and the windows let in the last golden light of day. "Much obliged," he said softly, removing his hat. "Been a while since these walls saw such hair." They ate their simple supper in relative silence, the beans and cornbread filling the empty spaces between them. Clarissa watched Luke from the corner of her eye, noting how he sat straight in his chair despite the day's work, how he bowed his head briefly before eating. Finally, she gathered her courage to ask the question that had been building since their first meeting. "Why does a man like you live so alone out here?" Luke's hand stilled on his plate. For a long moment, he stared at nothing, as if seeing something far beyond the cabin walls. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The war emptied me." 3 simple words, heavy with unspoken pain. He offered nothing more, but the weight of memory hung thick in the air between them. Clarissa nodded slowly, recognizing the echoes of old wounds in his voice. She didn't press further, understanding that some hurts ran too deep for casual sharing. Instead, she rose and began clearing the plates, letting the familiar rhythm of household tasks fill the growing darkness. The first hints of dawn crept through the cabin windows, painting pale squares on the rough-hewn floor. Clarissa woke to the sound of Luke's steady breathing from his bedroll near the stove. She rose quietly, her joints stiff from sleeping in the narrow bed he'd insisted she take. Moving with practiced care, she opened the stove's iron door and stirred the banked coals. Adding kindling and small logs, she coaxed the fire back to life. The familiar task brought comfort, reminding her of countless mornings in the railroad camp kitchens. Once the fire caught properly, Clarissa gathered flour, salt, and the precious cake of yeast Luke kept wrapped in waxed paper. Her strong hands worked the ingredients together, muscle memory taking over as she added warm water from the kettle. The dough slowly came together under her experienced touch dot as she kneaded. Hymn rose unbidden to her lips. She hummed softly at first, then let the melody grow stronger. Amazing grace. The notes flowing naturally as she worked the dough with steady strokes. The simple song filled the quiet cabin with its gentle reminder of mercy. Luke stirred on, his bedroll but didn't move, watching through half-closed eyes as Clarissa worked. The morning light caught the flour dust dancing around her hands, and her humming blended with the crackle of the stove fire. Something in his chest tightened. At the peaceful scene, when the dough was properly elastic, Clarissa set it in a bowl to rise, covering it with a clean cloth. She turned to find Luke sitting up, pulling on his boots. "Never thought to hear hymns in this cabin again," he said quietly. "My mother used to sing that one." Clarissa nodded, suddenly self-conscious about her singing. "Helps the bread rise better," she said, trying to keep her voice light. That's what my grandmother always claimed, anyway. After a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush, Luke headed out to start the day's work. To his surprise, Clarissa followed, wrapping herself in the shawl he'd given her against the morning chill. "Might as well learn what needs doing," she said firmly. "Can't spend all day inside, even if that's what you plan for your wife." The word carried a hint of challenge. Luke's expression didn't change, but something like approval flickered in his eyes. "Reckon that's fair enough. We'll start with the chickens." He showed her the coop, explaining how to scatter feed and gather eggs. Clarissa took to the task naturally, her gentle handling keeping the hens calm. Next came the water barrel, which needed filling from the nearby spring. Luke demonstrated how to work the pump, then watched as Clarissa managed the heavy bucket with determined efficiency. The morning passed in a rhythm of chores, each one building on the last. Clarissa absorbed Luke's quiet instructions, asking practical questions and adapting his methods to suit her strength. By midday, she had a solid grasp of the basic routine. They were checking the calf pen when a movement caught Luke's attention. A gray shape slipped through the tall grass near the fence. A wolf, lean and hungry-looking, eyeing the young cattle. Luke reached slowly for his rifle, not wanting to make any sudden moves that might spook the herd. The calves were already nervous, pressing against their mothers and making soft sounds of distress. A panic stampede could be deadly in the small pen. Before Luke could take aim, Clarissa moved. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the shotgun hanging on the pens put there for just such emergencies. The weapon looked enormous in her hands, but she handled it with surprising confidence. The blast shattered the morning quiet. Clarissa had aimed high, sending a warning shot over the wolf's head. The predator bolted, vanishing into the grass as quickly as it had appeared. The cattle, startled by the noise but contained by the sturdy fence, settled quickly. Luke turned to Clarissa, who still held the shotgun steady. "Where'd you learn to handle a scattergun like that?" "Railroad camps weren't always in friendly territory," she answered, carefully lowering the weapon. "Cook tent had to be defended, same as any other part of camp. Nobody much cared who held the gun when trouble came." Luke nodded slowly, a new respect evident in his gaze. They finished checking the pen in comfortable silence, each thinking about the morning's excitement. That evening, They sat at the table while lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls. The bread Clarissa had made that morning was still slightly warm, filling the cabin with its homey scent. Luke broke off a piece, savoring the flavor before speaking. "Been thinking," he said carefully. "Got to admit, you've shown more grit today than most men I've known. That Volf could have done real damage if you hadn't acted quick." Clarissa paused with her cup halfway to her lips. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a rich, genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. "Lord above, did you think I was some delicate flower after what you saw in that courthouse?" The tension that had lingered between them since their strange marriage eased slightly. Luke's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "No, ma'am, can't say that ever crossed my mind." "Good," Clarissa said firmly, but her eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Because delicate flowers don't last long on the frontier, and I aim to last." They finished their meal in companionable quiet, the lamplight gentle on their faces. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, but the sound held no threat, just another voice in the night's wild chorus. Days settled into a comfortable rhythm at the cabin. Each morning, Clarissa rose before dawn, lighting the stove and starting breakfast. The aroma of coffee and fresh biscuits would draw Luke in from his early chores, his boots leaving dusty prints on the swept floor during the days. Clarissa's singing drifted through the open windows as she worked. Her voice carried across the yard, mixing with the cluck of chickens and the distant lowing of cattle. Old hymns and work songs filled the once quiet cabin with life. The walls seemed to soften, warming to the sound of her strong, clear voice. Luke spent his days mending fences and tending to the livestock. He'd pause sometimes, leaning on his fence posts, listening to Clarissa's singing carry on the wind. A slight smile would touch his weathered face before he returned to his work. The meals Clarissa prepared were hearty and filling thick stews with dumplings, golden cornbread dripping with honey, beans seasoned perfectly with salt pork. Luke's portions grew larger as she insisted he eat properly. "Can't work from sunup to sundown on coffee, air," she'd say firmly, filling his plate again. One Sunday morning, the sound of hoofbeats brought them both to the cabin door. A woman on horseback, her dark riding skirt gathered neatly as she guided her. Mari up the path. Luke straightened, recognition crossing his face. "Mrs. Halley," he called out in greeting, stepping forward to help her dismount. "Didn't expect to see you out this far." Mrs. Halley, the Reverend's wife, was a trim woman with gray-streaked hair tied back severely. She carried several wrapped packages tied to her saddle. Her warm smile at Luke faltered slightly as she caught sight of Clarissa standing in the doorway. "I brought some supplies Nathan thought you might need," Mrs. Halley said, recovering quickly. "Threads, needles, some dried herbs. For medicine?" She paused, studying Clarissa with careful consideration. Clarissa stepped forward, smoothing her apron with suddenly nervous hands. "Would you care for some coffee, Mrs. Halley?" "Just made fresh." Something in Clarissa's dignified manner seemed to decide something for Mrs. Halley. Her smile returned, genuine and kind. "That would be lovely, thank you." Inside the cabin, Mrs. Halley noted the swept floors, the neatly made bed, the fresh curtains Clarissa had fashioned from flour sacks. The whole space spoke of care and attention. She accepted the cup Clarissa offered, inhaling the rich aroma appreciatively. "You made quite a home here," Mrs. Halley said, looking between Luke and Clarissa. "Every man deserves a good home, and every woman dignity. I can see you found both." Luke ducked his head, touched by her words and their simple acceptance. "Much obliged, Mrs. Halley, for the visit and the supplies both." After sharing coffee and some of Clarissa's fresh bread, Mrs. Halley took her leave. Luke helped her mount up, and they watched her ride away. The packages she'd brought sitting on the table inside, Clarissa stood in the doorway, her hands twisted in her apron. "Not used to kindness from white women," she said quietly. "Most times they look right through me, like I'm not even there." Luke turned to her, his eyes gentle. "You'll have to get used to it here," he said softly. "Mrs. Hale's got a good heart. Others will come around too, given time. But the shadow of the outside world couldn't be kept at bay forever." When their salt barrel ran low, Luke had to make a trip into town. He rode out early one morning, promising to return by sunset. Town was busy with the usual Saturday traffic when Luke tied his horse outside the general store. He felt the stares as he entered, noticed the way conversations died when he approached. The storekeeper filled his order slowly, avoiding his eyes. "Here you got yourself a wife," one man said loudly from near the door. "If you can call her that." Luke's shoulders stiffened, but he kept his focus on counting out coins for the salt. Other voices muttered in the background, words like shame and disgrace carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "A man loses his pride, takes up with the likes of her." Another voice added, "Ain't natural." Luke's hand tightened on the salt bag, but he kept his voice steady. "My business ain't yours to judge," he said quietly, but with steel under the words. He left the store with his purchases, the weight of hostile stares following him out. The ride home seemed longer than usual, the beautiful afternoon dimmed by, the ugly words that echoed in his mind. Clarissa was waiting when he returned, the cabin warm with the smell of supper cooking. One look at his face told her all she needed to know about how he'd been received in town. "They won't let it be," she said. "Not really a question." Luke set the salt down carefully on the table. "No," he admitted, his voice heavy. "Reckon they?" "Well," Clarissa nodded, turning back to tend the stove. Her shoulders were straight, her head held high, but Luke could see the tension in her movements. The weight of others' judgment had found them even here, in their quiet valley. The evening settled around them, full of things unsaid. Luke ate the supper Clarissa set before him, his usual appetite dulled by the day's events. Outside, a whippoorwill called in the gathering dusk, its lonely song echoing across the peaceful valley that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress against a hostile world. The evening shadows lengthened across the cabin. Flores Clarissa sat at the rough-hewn table, a small leather-bound book open before her. The lamplight cast a warm glow on her face, but her hands trembled as they hovered over the worn pages. She had pulled the ledger from her bundle while Luke was outside finishing his evening chores. And now she sat frozen, lost in troubled thoughts. Luke's heavy boots crossed the porch, and the door creaked open. He paused in the doorway, noting Clarissa's unusual stillness. The familiar sense of supper still lingered, beans and cornbread, but the dishes sat untouched on the sideboard. Something was wrong. "Clarissa?" His voice was gentle, pitched low like he would use to calm a spooked horse. She didn't look up, her fingers tracing the neat columns of numbers on the yellowed pages. "Been carrying this burden too long," she whispered. "Reckon it's time you knew what kind of trouble you brought along with me." Luke pulled out the other chair, its legs scraping softly against the floor. He settled his large frame carefully, waiting. The lamp flame flickered, making shadows dance across the table between them. "When I worked the railroad commissary," Clarissa began, her voice strengthening, "I kept all the accounts. Every penny that came in, every bit of supply that went out." She tapped the ledger. "Did it right here in this book?" Luke leaned forward, studying the careful rows of numbers and notes written in Clarissa's steady hand. The pages were filled with detailed records, quantities, prices, deliveries. One day, I noticed things weren't adding up right. Her voice caught. Big orders of beef and flour marked as delivered, but never reaching the cook cars. Tools and supplies vanishing into thin air. Thousands of dollars worth, month after month. Luke's jaw tightened as understanding dawned. Company men stealing. Clarissa nodded, turning a page with trembling fingers. Agent Brandt and his crowd, skimming off the top. Selling supplies out the back door, pocketing the money. Her eyes filled with tears. I was raised to believe in right and wrong. Couldn't just stay quiet, seeing them rob the company blind while honest workers went hungry. "You reported it?" Luke said softly. It wasn't a question. Went straight to the regional office. Clarissa's laugh was bitter. Next thing I knew, Brent was accusing me of the theft. Said I'd been cooking the books, stealing for years. Had his friends back him up, every one of them lying through their teeth. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Nobody was going to take the word of a colored woman over a respectable white businessman. Luke's hands clenched into fists on the table. That's how you ended up in chains. They made sure I couldn't tell what I knew. Clarissa's voice broke. Charge me. With theft threw me in jail. Would have rotted there if you hadn't. She stopped, choking back a sob. And now I've brought their vengeance down on you too. The lamp flame guttered as a night wind slipped through the cabin's chinked walls. Outside, a coyote's lonely howl rose. From the darkness. I'm so sorry, Luke, Clarissa whispered. You showed me nothing but kindness, and I repaid you by putting your life in danger. They won't let this ledger stay hidden. Won't let me live free, knowing what I know. Luke reached across the table, his calloused hand gently lifting Clarissa's chin until she met his gaze. His eyes were steady, full of quiet strength. Truth isn't a curse, he said firmly. It's the only way forward. We'll face whatever comes, together. Clarissa stared at him, wonder and fear warring in her expression. You believe me, every word. Luke's voice was certain. Numbers don't lie, even when men do. And I've known good people and corrupt ones. Easy to see what you are. Fresh tears spilled down Clarissa's cheeks. What are we going to do? For tonight, we rest? Luke squeezed her hand once before releasing it. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to use that ledger to set things right. But sleep proved elusive for both of them. That night, Luke lay on his pallet by the hearth, staring at the ceiling, his mind working through the danger they faced. The railroad was powerful, its men ruthless. They'd need help to stand against them. Dot in her bed, behind the curtain, Clarissa clutched the ledger to her chest, listening to the coyote's mournful chorus. Each howl seemed closer, more threatening. She thought of the railroad's long reach, of Agent Brandt's cold eyes. Had they already marked Luke's cabin? Were they watching, waiting to strike? The night hours crept by, marked only by the settling of logs in the cooling fireplace and the wild songs of the coyotes. Two people lay awake in the darkness, each carrying the weight of the truth between them, each knowing that tomorrow would bring them one step closer to either justice or destruction. The ledger sat on the table where they'd left it. Its secrets, now shared. In the morning, they would have to decide what to do with its dangerous truth. But for now, the cabin stood quiet in the Colorado night, as if holding its breath, waiting to see what dawn would bring. The morning sun painted the meadow in shades of gold, as Luke helped Clarissa down from his horse. They had ridden for nearly an hour, climbing steadily through sage-dotted hills until reaching this hidden valley, where his cattle grazed. A grove of ancient cottonwoods offered welcome shade, their leaves dancing in the gentle breeze. It's beautiful up here, Clarissa breathed, taking in the sweep of wildflowers and the distant blue mountains. Her face glowed with pleasure as she spread a worn blanket beneath the largest tree. Luke tied his horse to a low branch and settled beside her, his long legs stretched out on the grass. From his saddlebag, he produced bread, cheese, and dried apple slices wrapped in a clean cloth. Clarissa arranged their simple feast while Luke watched his cattle graze in the distance, their red-brown forms dotting the green expanse. Reminds me of Sunday picnics after church, back when I was little, Clarissa said softly, handing Luke a piece of bread. Mama would pack fried chicken and sweet potato pie. We'd spread blankets under the big oak trees. Luke nodded, chewing thoughtfully. Then he cleared his throat. Say, I heard something in town might make you laugh. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to telling jokes. Fellow went to buy a mule, see? And the seller says it's got one peculiar habit. He stumbled over the words, his usual grace deserting him as he tried to remember the punchline. Clarissa watched his face redden, and suddenly she burst out, laughing, not at the mangled joke, but at his earnest attempt to entertain her. After a moment, Luke's deep chuckle joined hers, and the sound of their shared mirth echoed across the meadow. Lord have mercy, Clarissa wiped tears from her eyes. I don't think I've laughed like that in years. Neither have I, Luke admitted, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The tension of recent days seemed to lift from his shoulders as they sat together in the dappled shade, sharing their simple meal in comfortable silence. Later that afternoon, back at the cabin, Clarissa bustled about the kitchen with purpose. She had invited guests for Sunday dinner, her first real chance to be a proper hostess. The thought made her hands tremble slightly as she worked, but excitement outweighed her nervousness. Mrs. Holly arrived first, bringing fresh-baked rolls and warm greetings. She immediately offered to help, but Clarissa shooed her to a chair with a cup of coffee. "You just rest those feet, Mrs. Holly. This kitchen's my domain today." Soon after came 3 orphan children Clarissa had met on her last trip to town, 2 girls and a boy, their clothes clean but patched. They had been gathering eggs outside the general store, and Clarissa's heart had gone out to their hungry eyes. Now they sat wide-eyed at Luke's table, watching her pull a golden brown chicken from the oven. The last guest was Miguel, a half Apache boy of about 14, who sometimes helped Luke with stray cattle. He slipped in quietly, but Clarissa made sure to serve him an extra large portion, noting his thin frame. The boy's shy smile warmed her heart. Lamplight filled the cabin with a golden glow as they gathered around the table. The simple room had been transformed, fresh wildflowers in a jar, plates gleaming, savory smells filling the air. Clarissa had prepared everything with care: roast chicken, cornbread, green beans with bacon, and a sweet potato pie that made the children's eyes grow round. "Shall we sing grace?" Mrs. Halley suggested, and Clarissa's strong, clear voice led them in amazing grace. The others joined in, their voices blending in the warm evening air. Even Luke hummed quietly, surprising them all. The meal was filled with conversation and laughter. The orphans told stories about their adventures in town, while Miguel shared tales of tracking clever coyotes. Mrs. Holly contributed news of neighbors and church meetings, her kind eyes twinkling as she watched Clarissa manage it all with natural grace. Luke sat at the head of the table, speaking little but taking everything in. He watched Clarissa move about the cabin, filling plates, touching shoulders, making each person feel welcome and cared for. Her face glowed with joy as she urged second helpings on everyone. This was more than just a meal, it was the birth of something new in his home. When the pie was reduced to crumbs and the last story told, their guests began to leave. Mrs. Holly hugged Clarissa warmly, whispering something that made her eyes shine. The children carefully carried wrapped leftovers, and Miguel ducked his head in shy thanks as he slipped out into the gathering dusk as Clarissa began clearing the table. Luke touched her arm gently. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. She paused, a stack of plates in her hands, and smiled, a full, free smile that transformed her face. "You know something? This is the first time in my life I've been called a hostess, not a servant." Her voice caught slightly. "First time I've welcomed guests to my own table, served them as equals." Luke nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Together they finished cleaning up, working in comfortable silence as the last rays of sunset painted the cabin walls in shades of gold. The evening's warmth lingered in the air, along with the echoes of laughter and song through the window. They could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. The cabin that had once felt empty and hollow now seemed to hold something precious, the beginnings of family, the promise of belonging. In the simple act of sharing bread and welcome, they had created something neither had dared to hope for. A true home. Dawn broke crisp and clear over Luke's Valley, the morning after their joyful Sunday dinner. Clarissa hummed as she swept broken eggshells and flour from the wooden counter, remembering the children's laughter. Even the lingering scent of sweet potato pie brought a smile to her face. Luke had gone to check the cattle at first light, leaving her to tidy their home. Their home. The thought still caught her by surprise, warming her heart like morning sunshine. She paused at the window, watching meadowlarks flit between fence posts, when a cloud of dust on the road caught her eye. Her heart stopped. Riders were approaching, 5 men on horseback, led by the familiar lean figure of Sheriff Dodd. His badge glinted in the morning light. As they thundered into the yard, Clarissa's hands began to shake. She knew why they had come. Luke appeared from behind the barn, drawn by the commotion. He moved deliberately to stand between the riders and his front door, his stance wide and ready. "Step aside, Brannon," Sheriff Dodd called out, his voice carrying. "Across the yard. We're here for the woman. She's wanted for theft of railroad property." "That's a lie," Luke answered evenly, though his shoulders tensed. "She's my wife now, legally bought and freed." One of the riders, a well-dressed man, Clarissa, recognized as railroad agent Brandt, urged his horse forward. "The debt trust holds prior claim. She stole company records valuable ledgers. Hand her over peacefully." Clarissa's fingers clutched the windowsill. Through the glass, she watched Luke shake his head. "You'll not touch her," he said, his voice low but firm. "She's done nothing wrong except expose your corruption." "Wrong answer." Sheriff Dodd nodded to his men. Two dismounted, moving to flank Luke while the others drew pistols. "Last chance, Brannon," Brandt warned. "Don't make this ugly." Luke's only response was to plant his feet more firmly. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the yard as the two men rushed him. The first threw a punch that Luke blocked, but the second caught him in the ribs with a heavy boot. Luke grunted, staggering. He managed to land a solid blow that sent one attacker sprawling, but the other tackled him hard from behind. Clarissa couldn't watch anymore. She burst through the door, her voice rising above the sounds of struggle. "Stop, please, you're killing him." The remaining riders dismounted quickly, grabbing her arms. Cold iron clicked around her wrists as they shackled her once more. The familiar weight of chains made her want to weep, but she forced herself to stand straight. Luke fought to rise, blood streaming from his nose, but more kicks drove him back into the dirt. He curled around his ribs, gasping. "Get her on a horse," Sheriff Dodd ordered. Then he turned to the cabin with a cold smile. "Brandt, shall we make sure she has nothing to come back to?" The railroad agent lit a match, studying its flame. "Can't leave evidence of company records lying around, can we?" They strode into the cabin, the home she had just begun to love. Moments later, smoke began curling from the windows. The sound of breaking glass rang out as they overturned the Sunday dinner table, using it for kindling. "No!" Clarissa screamed as flames licked up the wooden walls. "Please, no." All her small treasures, the hymnal, her mother's quilt, the children's. Thank you drawings would burn to ash. Sheriff Dodd grabbed her chain, yanking her toward his horse. "You're going somewhere you'll never cause trouble again," he sneered. "No more fine dinners for you, woman." Luke managed to push himself to. His knees, one arm wrapped around his battered ribs. His eyes met Clarissa's, full of anguish and helpless rage. "Clarissa," he choked out. "Luke." She struggled against the chains, but the men dragged her away. They forced her onto a horse, binding her legs to the stirrups. As they rode out, Clarissa twisted to look back one last time. Luke knelt in the dirt, watching their home burn, smoke staining the morning sky black. The sight of him growing smaller, more distant, with each hoofbeat, broke something inside her. Her tears fell freely now, dropping onto the horse's mane as they galloped away. Behind them, flames devoured every trace of the joy and belonging she had finally found. The smoke rose higher, carrying her dreams away on the wind. Luke staggered. Through the smoldering doorway of his cabin, each step sending daggers of pain through his ribs. Smoke stung his eyes as he surveyed the destruction. The table where they had shared so many meals lay splintered and charred. Broken dishes littered the floor, mixed with scattered ashes that had once been curtains Clarissa had sewn. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees on the soot-covered floorboards. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the soft crackle of dying embers and his own ragged breathing. The emptiness felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. Something caught his eye amid the wreckage, a corner of dark leather protruding from beneath an overturned chair. Luke crawled forward, ignoring the protest of his battered body, and carefully pulled the object free. It was Clarissa's hymnal, its edges blackened, but its core somehow preserved. He opened it with trembling hands, finding the pages still intact. Despite the smoke damage, holding the book close to his chest, Luke bowed his head. Memories he had long kept buried came rushing back. The crack of rifles, the screams of dying men, the weight of fallen comrades in his arms. He had survived the war only to retreat into solitude, letting guilt and grief build walls around his heart. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been running so long. Running from the past, from connection, from your call, to stand against evil." His fingers traced the hymnal's worn cover. "But you sent Clarissa to remind me what it means to have courage, to fight for what's right." Luke's prayer grew stronger, even as tears tracked clean lines down his ash-stained face. "Give me strength now, Lord, not just for myself, but for her. She showed me how to make a home again, how to welcome others, how to live instead of just survive. I won't let them steal another life. Not this time." With renewed purpose, Luke forced himself to stand. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his chest, but he pushed through it. He retrieved his rifle from where it had fallen during the fight, checking that it was still serviceable. Next, he found his Bible on the shelf where it had been protected from the worst of the flames. Luke searched carefully through the debris until he located Clarissa's hidden ledger, the evidence of railroad corruption that had started all this. He wrapped it carefully in an oilcloth and tucked it into his saddlebag, along with the Bible and hymnal. Dawn was still hours away as Luke made his way to the barn. His horse nickered softly as he entered, and Luke took comfort in the familiar sounds and smells. His hands moved automatically through the routine of saddling, though each reach and lift made his cracked ribs scream in protest. "Easy, boy," he murmured as he tightened the cinch. "We've got work to do." As he led the horse out into the cool pre-dawn air, words from one of Clarissa's favorite hymns echoed in his mind. "God will make a way where there seems to be no way." She had sung it while kneading bread, while feeding chickens, while making their house into a home. The melody carried memories of her strength, her dignity, her unwavering faith despite all she had endured. Luke eased himself carefully into the saddle, gritting his teeth against the pain. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as he pointed his horse toward town. He might be one man against the railroad's power, but he wasn't riding alone. He had truth in his saddlebags, justice in his heart, and God's promise that light would overcome darkness. The morning star hung bright above the horizon as Luke urged his horse forward. Somewhere ahead, Clarissa waited. This time, he wouldn't stand silent in the face of evil. This time, he would fight. Note, this scene fully covers all the required elements from the outline, showing Luke's physical and emotional journey from collapse to resolve, incorporating the specific items mentioned: hymnal, rifle, Bible, ledger, and emphasizing the key moment of rediscovered faith and courage, all while maintaining the appropriate tone and pacing. The morning sun cast long shadows down Main Street as Luke rode into town. His horse's hooves kicked up dust from the hard-packed earth, drawing curious glances from townspeople starting their day. Pain shot through his ribs with each step of his mount, but he kept his back straight and his eyes forward. Whispers followed, hymned like autumn leaves in the wind. Women paused in their sweeping to stare. Men gathered in doorways, their conversations dropping to hushed tones. A group of children stopped their play to gawk at his bruised face and torn shirt. "That's the fool who bought the colored woman," someone muttered loud enough to be heard. "Looks like he finally got what was coming to him," another voice answered. With a laugh, Luke ignored them all, guiding his horse toward the courthouse. The building loomed ahead, its wooden steps already crowded with spectators, eager for the morning's entertainment. News of Clarissa's recapture had spread fast. He dismounted carefully, each movement deliberate to avoid jarring his injured ribs. The leather satchel containing the ledger felt heavy against his side as he climbed the courthouse steps. The crowd parted before him, their mockery fading at the sight of his grim determination. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with excitement. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, catching motes in its beam. The wooden benches were packed tight with townsfolk, all craning their necks toward the front where Judge Kettle presided from his elevated seat. Clarissa stood before the judge's bench, chains binding her wrists. Her head was bowed, but Her shoulders remained straight despite the weight of the shackles and the crowd's derision. Railroad agent Brant stood nearby, a satisfied smirk playing across his face. Order! Order! Judge Kettle banged his gavel as Luke pushed through the crowd. We are here to sentence this woman for theft of railroad property, and the ledger slammed onto the judge's desk with a sharp crack that silenced the room. Luke's voice carried to every corner. These pages tell a different story, Your Honor. Judge Kettle's face reddened. How dare you interrupt these proceedings? Remove this man at once. No. Luke's quiet word held more force than the judge's shout. These records show who the real thieves are. Every crook deal, every stolen dollar, every false charge against honest workers. It's all here in the railroad's own numbers. Clarissa's head snapped up, her eyes meeting Luke's with a mix of fear and hope. Agent Brandt's smirk vanished, replaced by a dangerous scowl. Preposterous. Brandt stepped forward. This man is clearly deranged. The woman's guilt is already established. Then you won't mind if we examine these records. Luke cut in. He opened the ledger, his finger tracing down columns of neat figures in Clarissa's precise handwriting, starting with the missing supplies. From March 3rd, 1878, $300 worth of materials vanished from the commissary, blamed on the cook. But these entries show they were diverted to private construction on Agent Brandt's new house. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Judge Kettle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I move that we hear testimony, Luke continued, his voice steady. From the woman who kept these books. From the woman you tried to silence. The judge's gavel crashed down again. This is highly irregular. We cannot simply let her speak. The shout came from the back of the room. Mrs. Hawley had arrived, standing tall in her Sunday best. If you claim to serve justice, then hear the truth. Other voices joined in, the mood of the crowd shifting like wind before a storm. Judge Kettle glanced nervously between Brandt's darkening face and the restless townsfolk. Very well, he said. Finally, the witness may testify. Clarissa stepped forward, chains clinking. For a moment, she seemed to shrink under the weight of all those staring eyes. Then she straightened, lifting her chin. When she spoke, her voice started soft but grew stronger with each word. I served the railroad faithful for 6 years, she began. Cooking for crews, keeping records clean and honest. I saw the numbers. That didn't add up. Supplies disappearing, costs inflated, workers charged for goods they never got. Her eyes found Brandt's face. When I reported it, they said no one would believe a colored woman over a railroad man. They took everything, my job, my freedom, my good name. The room had fallen so quiet that the tick of the wall clock echoed like gunshots. Clarissa's voice rose with conviction, filling every corner. But they couldn't take my truth. Every entry in that book is exact, every figure checked twice. I swore an oath on my mama's Bible to keep honest books, and that's what I did. She gestured at the ledger with her shackled hands. The proof is there for any who care to look. The railroad men are the thieves, not me. Luke watched faces in. The crowd changed as Clarissa spoke out, replacing certainty, sympathy overcoming prejudice. Even the judge seemed affected, his expression troubled as he studied the ledger's pages. This testimony, Judge Kettle began slowly, raises concerning questions about it raises nothing but lies. Brandt surged forward, his carefully maintained facade cracking. You can't possibly take the word of a woman who kept better books than you could hide? Luke's quiet interruption cut through Brandt's bluster. The numbers don't lie, Agent Brandt. And neither does she. The crowd had fallen silent again. But this time it was a different kind of quiet, the silence of people confronting an uncomfortable truth. Luke saw realization dawn on face after face as they looked at Clarissa with new eyes, seeing not prisoner, but a woman of dignity and courage. Mrs. Hale's voice rang out again. I've seen her character these past weeks. She's made a home where there was emptiness, brought light where there was darkness. If she says these records are true, then I believe her. Other voices joined in, first a few, then more. The tide of opinion turned like a river changing course, slow but unstoppable. Some called for the records to be examined by independent accountants. Others demanded Clarissa's immediate release. Through it all, Clarissa stood tall, her truth finally heard, her dignity unbroken. She caught Luke's eye and gave him the smallest of nods, a gesture of thanks that meant more than words could say, as Clarissa's final words echoed through the courtroom. A sudden commotion erupted near the front. Railroad agent Brandt's face had twisted into a mask of fury. He lunged forward, reaching for Clarissa with grasping hands. Behind him, Sheriff Dodd and two other railroad enforcers moved to flank her, their boots scraping against the wooden floor. "Caesar," Brandt shouted. "She's still railroad property." But before they could reach Clarissa, a wall of townspeople surged forward. Mrs. Halley, her gray hair gleaming in the dusty sunlight, planted herself directly in front of Clarissa. Other women from her Sunday social circle joined her, forming a protective circle. Their skirts rustled as they linked arms, faces set with determination. "You'll not touch her," Mrs. Halley declared, her voice ringing with authority. "Not while there's still justice in this town." More townsfolk rose from their seats. The blacksmith's wife, who had once turned her nose up at Clarissa, now stood shoulder to shoulder with Mrs. Halley. The cooper, who had laughed at the auction, stepped forward, his broad frame blocking Sheriff Dodd's path. Reverend Halley pushed through the crowd, his worn Bible clutched in one hand. He moved to stand beside his wife, facing the railroad men with quiet strength. "Truth," the Reverend's voice carried to every corner of the room, "is God's light in darkness. It will not be silenced by force or fraud." He turned to address the packed courtroom. "We have heard this woman's testimony. We have seen the evidence of corruption. Will we now stand idle while injustice prevails? No." The shout came from dozens of throats. Judge Kettle shifted uncomfortably on his bench, his face mottled red. The ledger lay open before him, its neat columns of figures damning in their precision. His eyes darted between Brandt's threatening glare and the resolute faces of the townsfolk. "Order." He banged his gavel weakly. "I must, that is to say." He tugged at his collar, sweat beading on his brow. "In light of new evidence, this court has no choice but to." "Choose carefully, Judge," Brandt snarled. "Remember who pays for your new courthouse?" But the tide had turned. The townspeople pressed closer, their collective presence more powerful than any railroad money. The judge's shoulders sagged in defeat. "The charges against Clarissa Carter are hereby dismissed," he declared, each word dragged from him like pulling teeth. "She is to be released immediately." Luke stepped forward, his key ready in hand. The chains fell away from Clarissa's wrists with a heavy clank. She stood unshackled, trembling, as decades of weight lifted from her shoulders. Sheriff Dodd watched his authority crumble before his eyes. The townsfolk who had once jumped at his commands now stared at him with open contempt. His badge, once a symbol of power, now marked him as a corrupt man's puppet. The sheriff's voice cracked. He unpinned his star with shaking fingers. "I resign my post?" He dropped the badge on the floor, the metal clattering against wood. Without another word, he pushed through the crowd and fled the courthouse. Clarissa swayed on her feet, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. Luke caught her as she stumbled, his strong arm steadying her despite his injured ribs. She pressed her face against his chest, tears soaking into his shirt. The crowd that had once mocked the union now watched in hushed amazement. They saw not a mismatched pair, but a man of principle and a woman of courage. Whispers rippled through the courthouse, but they were no longer cruel jibes. Instead, people murmured about strength, about dignity, about truth prevailing against all odds. "I never," one woman whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "She stood up to the whole railroad," a man said with newfound respect. "Braver than most men I know." Mrs. Halley approached the couple, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You can hold your head high now, Clarissa. The truth has set you free." Clarissa lifted her face from Luke's chest, her cheeks wet but her eyes shining. For the first time since her arrest, she stood straight back before the town, no longer a prisoner, no longer accused. She was Clarissa Carter, vindicated at last. The the morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows, painting the scene in golden light. Luke kept his arm around Clarissa's waist, supporting her as she faced the crowd. The ledger that had carried her truth through years of silence lay open on the judge's bench, its pages testament to her integrity, Brant and his. Remaining men slunk toward the door, their power broken by the weight of truth and the conscience of a community awakened. As they left, the tension in the room dissolved into something new, a sense of justice restored, of wrongs made right. One by one, townspeople approached Clarissa. Those who had laughed now offered awkward apologies. Those who had turned away now extended hands in friendship. The transformation was written on every face. Mockery had given way to respect, prejudice to understanding. Through it all, Clarissa stood tall beside Luke, her dignity no longer a defiant shield, but a crown, for all to see. In that moment, she was more than free, she was triumphant. The autumn air carried the sharp scent of fresh-cut pine as Luke and Clarissa surveyed the charred remains of the cabin. 2 weeks had passed since the courthouse confrontation, and healing had begun both for their spirits and for Luke's bruised ribs. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as neighbors' wagons rumbled up the dirt track, loaded with lumber, tools, and helping hands. Tom Henderson, the cooper, who had once laughed at their union, was first to arrive. He jumped down from his wagon, hat clutched to his chest. "Miss Clarissa, Mr. Brannan," he nodded, eyes downcast. "Brought some good oak boards. Reckon they might help make things right." More wagons followed. Mrs. Holly arrived with her church. Ladies, baskets brimming with biscuits and stew. The blacksmith brought nails and hinges he'd forged himself. Even the judge's wife came, carrying seeds for a new kitchen garden. Clarissa stood on the scorched porch, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I never thought to see such kindness," she whispered to Luke. He squeezed her shoulder. "Folks can change when truth opens their eyes." The rebuilding began with many hands making light work. Men stripped away burned timbers while women cleared debris. Luke directed the effort with quiet authority, showing younger men how to notch logs and lay proper foundations. Clarissa organized the food and water, keeping workers fed and spirits high. Children darted between the adults, carrying tools and fetching water. They no longer shied away from Clarissa but crowded around her, begging for stories. She obliged. During rest breaks, her rich voice carrying across the yard as she told tales of railroad days and frontier courage. The new kitchen took shape first, at Luke's insistence. He knew how much it meant to Clarissa, not just a place to cook, but a heart for their home. The hearth rose stone by stone, each carefully placed. When the chimney finally stood complete, Clarissa ran her hands over the smooth rocks, remembering the burnt ruins of weeks before. "It's stronger now," Luke said softly, "like us." As the days passed, the cabin grew. Neighbors who couldn't stay all day came when they could, bringing what they had to share. The half-Apache boy who had attended their Sunday dinner brought his father, a skilled carpenter. Together they crafted beautiful window frames from blonde pine. Clarissa supervised every detail of the kitchen's resurrection. She insisted on broad windowsills for cooling pies and plenty of space for teaching neighborhood girls to bake. The neighbors watched her in her element, directing, planning, creating, and saw the capable woman Luke had recognized from the start. One bright morning, Luke disappeared before dawn. He returned with his wagon loaded with saplings, young apple trees with roots carefully wrapped in burlap. Clarissa stepped out to find him digging holes near the new porch. "What's this?" she asked, shading her eyes. Luke paused, leaning on his shovel. "Thought you might like an orchard. Take some years to bear proper, but good things are worth waiting for." His eyes met hers with quiet meaning. Clarissa knelt beside a sapling, touching its tender leaves. "Like us." She echoed his words from before. The afternoon sun slanted low when Mrs. Holly suggested an impromptu supper gathering. The cabin was nearly complete, lacking only final touches. Townsfolk arranged tables end to end on the fresh-swept porch while children strung wildflower garlands. Clarissa worked in her new kitchen, the hearth fire warming fresh bread. The space already felt like home, filled with delicious smells and the clatter of helping hands. Women who had once turned away now sought her recipes and advice. As twilight painted the sky purple, everyone gathered around the long tables. Lanterns cast a warm glow over faces that had transformed from hostile to friendly. Children perched on parrots' laps, and the Reverend sat beside the half-Apache carpenter. Deep in conversation about dovetail joints, Luke stood, clearing his throat for attention. Before we eat, I'd ask Clarissa to bless this meal. No one knows better the power of grace. Clarissa rose slowly, conscious of all eyes upon her. But these faces now held respect, not judgment. She lifted her hands and began to pray, her voice strong and clear in the evening air. Lord, we thank you for this food, this home, and these neighbors. You make all things new hearts, most of all. Amen. Amen, the gathering echoed. Before anyone could reach for food, Luke remained standing. He moved to Clarissa's side, taking her work-roughened hand in his. His voice carried across the hushed porch. Folks, you all know how Clarissa came to be. Here, some of you were at that courthouse auction. He paused, letting the uncomfortable memory settle. But what started as a matter of paper has grown into something true. Today, before you all, I want to claim this strong, brave woman properly, as my wife in heart and home. Clarissa's free hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Luke turned to face her fully, still holding her hand. If you'll have me, he said softly. She could only nod, overcome. Luke gathered her close, and the porch erupted in cheers and applause. Mrs. Holly dabbed at her eyes, while the children jumped up and down with excitement. The Reverend rose, beaming. Well, since we're all gathered, shall we make it official? And there, on their new porch, with the apple saplings swaying in the evening breeze, Luke and Clarissa exchanged simple vows. The same community that had once mocked their union now stood witness to its blessing, transformed by the power of truth and grace. As darkness settled over the valley, the gathering continued. Clarissa's good food and warm laughter filled their rebuilt home. Luke kept finding excuses to touch her hand or shoulder, as if reassuring himself this joy was real. Their visitors lingered, reluctant to leave the atmosphere of celebration and hope. The last rays of sun caught the windows. Luke and Clarissa had washed together that morning. Through the glass, the kitchen glowed like a beacon, its new hearth burning bright. Outside, the young apple trees stood straight and proud, promises of sweetness in years to come. Snow drifted silently across the valley, coating Luke and Clarissa's ranch in pristine white. The mountains loomed like sentinels against the steel-gray sky, their peaks disappearing into low clouds. Smoke curled from the cabin's chimney, carrying the scent of pine and promise into the crisp December air. Inside, Clarissa moved with practice. Grace around her kitchen, the hearth fire warming fresh bread and bubbling stew. The walls, once bare, now held dried herbs and children's drawings. Through the windows Luke had crafted with such care. The apple saplings stood like dark brush strokes against the snow, waiting for spring. 3 orphan children from the mining camp sat at the scrubbed wooden table, watching Clarissa knead dough with strong, sure hands. Sarah, the eldest at 12, helped stir the stew while her younger brothers played quietly with wooden horses Luke had carved. Their mother had passed in the fever that swept through last month, but they had found shelter here, wrapped in Clarissa's. Maternal warmth. 2 widows from town, Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Miller, sat by the fire mending clothes. They had once turned away from Clarissa in the street. Now they sought her wisdom and company, finding strength in her gentle faith. Their needles clicked in rhythm as Clarissa's rich voice lifted in an old hymn. Amazing grace, floating through the warm air as dusk approached, a lone rider appeared through the swirling snow. Luke met him at the door, young cowhand, half-frozen, and seeking shelter from the storm. Clarissa already had a bowl of stew ready, steam rising like a welcome flag. The cowhand's eyes widened at the scene before him, children laughing, women talking, the air rich with food and fellowship. Later, After the widows had gone home through the freshly broken trail, and the children were tucked into bed upstairs, Luke and Clarissa sat alone by the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as wind moaned around the cabin's sturdy corners. Luke reached for Clarissa's hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "Remember that day in the courthouse?" he asked softly. "When the judge laughed at my choice." Clarissa's smile was gentle in the firelight. Her free hand smoothed her apron, now dusted with flour from a day of feeding both body and soul. "But God smiled," she answered, her voice warm with certainty. Luke bowed his head, silver threading his temples now. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for the life we built together." His voice caught slightly, for making beauty from ashes. Outside, the winter wind keened against the mountains, but it found no purchase here. Within these walls, built and rebuilt by love, faith, and family prevailed. The cabin glowed like a beacon in the darkness, a testament to the power of dignity, restored and grace freely given. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here, where love speaks softly and stays.